Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I'm glad once again to have on this special guest, Kevin Kraut, who his father was Ogden Kraut, a very influential Mormon fundamentalist in the 20th century. And also, of course, I've had Ann Wild on, one of his plural wives, who did a fascinating interview with me a few years ago. And Kevin is a very interesting person. I met him a few years ago at one of Rob Meldrum's conferences and really hit it off with him very well. And he shared with me some stories that are really fascinating, stories that involve the Three Nephites, but also a story that involves a visitation from Ezra Taft Benson. And I think he told me that story when I first met him, and I talked with him about sharing this story. He's never publicly talked about it before, and he did went and seek some guidance on whether he should do this, and he's got the word that he can share this story. And I'm really excited to talk about it. But Kevin, first of all, thanks for coming back to the program today.
Yeah, it's great. I love these programs.
And I just also wanted to share real quick, folks, the website for Kevin's print shop called Old Pioneer Press. And it's here's his website, and they do publishing and binding and other services. So check out his website, oldpioneerpress.com. And also, and what town is this in, by the way, Kevin?
It's in Santaquin.
Santa Quinn, and it's on 97th West Main Street. They have
Yeah,
books, all sorts of cool things over there. So, and then you got a bookstore in there too? You sell books in
we
there?
sell books out of here. Yep. Yes.
Great. Well, next time I get out to Utah, I got to check out your place, my friend. So, well, you're an interesting person. Maybe just talk a little bit about your background. You are part of just talk a little bit about your faith journey because you're not part of Utah. Like, I mean, how would you describe yourself as an independent fundamentalist, or what would you say how you describe your faith?
Yeah. My mother, when my father had, been excommunicated and gone through that, and he started kind of exploring, fundamentalism a little bit more in detail. My mother, she was told spiritually, she prayed and she was told to stay in the church. And so I was raised LDS, and I grew up in Dudley Proving Grounds. And then I moved back down to Arizona, where my ancestry came from. My great grandfather was the first stake president of Arizona. And so we have a lot of branches of people there. And so I was raised, I served a mission in New Zealand. I just posted a recent story about my calling down there and some of the experiences with Matthew Calley's people and the people down there. And then, of course, I encountered my father a little bit more later in life, and I had very deep doctrinal questions, and he answered most of those. Some of which he sent me to Hugh Nibley. He had no idea. I don't know, go see Hugh, and so I went to see Hugh Nibley. And so deep doctrine was always kind of a question to me, and trying to understand, what was happening. I had some very strange experiences when I was a child. My dad had a seer stone that was given to him to show around. He wrote the book Sears and Sear Stones,
Okay.
and he took that seer stone and handed it around all over BYU and different places, and then never had any real encounters with anybody using it.
No, so this seer stone, tell me a little bit about this seer stone. Is this something that had a connection to Joseph Smith
It
or
was Joseph Smith's seer stone. It was the Belcher stone, the one with the kind of hole in it.
yeah?
I, I could show a picture of that if you want me to, but anyway, that stone, and it was promised to my father after the death of this individual who had loaned it to him. Anyway, he brought it home one day, and he sat down with me, and he was explaining what it was, and that Joseph Smith used it, and different things, and he says, "Here, why don't you try and see if you see anything?" And I looked in it and could see anything I wanted. And so I saw where some misplaced knives were that I couldn't find before. I found a lot of things that Dad had lost. There was a lot of things that The questions, astronomy. I saw things in space that later confirmed things that I knew about.
Oh.
So I had a very strange life. When I was young, I saw things, I dreamed things. I have a whole story about uh, a KGB officer.
Well, before I mean, this is really incredible because honestly, this is the first time I've ever talked to somebody who's actually handled a seer stone and actually could see things. I want for you to relate to us now. First of all, did you put the stone in a hat like Joseph did?
No, I actually held it in my left hand.
Okay, so you'd hold it in your
And
left hand, and then what? And how would these things appear to you?
and I was kind of closing my eyes at the time.
Okay, so you'd hold it
So
in
I
your
was
hand.
seeing things uh, through my mental eye
Or
or
your mind's eye.
mind's eye. Yes,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. And then when you would see these things, like how would you would you ask certain things of the stone, or would it just you would just close your eyes and just images would appear? How did this work?
Yeah, both actually. Sometimes when in my mind's eye, I would say, okay, well, where is this knife?
Okay.
And then I would see it. I would literally see it sitting near a couch or by a tree or, different ones that I found. And yes, it was actively that way.
Did you ever attempt to trans use it as a means of translating anything? Like
No,
Joseph? No?
a little kid, I just wasn't really thinking.
So you were just a
Actually,
kid, and whatever happened to this seer stone?
the seer stone was given back. It was Norman Pierce's stone. He
Okay.
was a friend of my dad's at the Dream Mine.
Uh-huh.
And how the Belcher stone came from, it was bought by Joseph Smith from a guy named Belcher. And then Philo Dibble, when Joseph Smith was killed, he ran in on the mantle, Joseph Smith's mantle, fireplace mantle, and it was sitting on top, and he grabbed it because he didn't want the bad guys to get it. So he brought it to Salt Lake City. Philo Dibble did, and then his granddaughter was Norman Pierce's wife.
Okay.
And Norman Pierce's family didn't really care much for the stone. It was just, they just weren't that interested in it or whatever.
Hmm.
And he left it in the will that was supposed to be a will to our family. What's interesting is that when I found that out, uh, it hadn't been but 5 years, 6 years since Norman Pierce had died. And we wanted to find out where it went. And we found out that the son who was in charge of the will had taken everything back to, I believe, Princeton. And we saw it in a book called Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview,
Mhm.
and it told where it was. And so we called there and sent them a picture of it and everything. And it was a guy named, I think his name was Carter. Anyway, he said, "No, there's no such stone here." And so we don't have that stone. Well, then several years later, after the statute of limitations ran out on the will, then Princeton sold it to a couple of attorneys or a couple of people. There's three people that actually purchased it.
Okay. And do you know where it's located now?
Yeah, it's here in Utah. And what happened was we went. I went to try and see it, and he said no, it'll have to be with a member of the family, the Pierce family. That's kind of how the little agreement was. And I thought, God, I don't know any of the Pierce family. And then a week later, in walked a lady, and she saw my dad's name, and she goes, "Oh, Ogden Kraut, I know him, and he was a good friend of my dad." And I found out that that was Norman Pierce's daughter, and so she was going to go get it back, and she went and raised some cane with them, and then I don't know, they hid it away or decided that they weren't going to give it back or whatever. But yeah, that's the story of the stone.
Wow, that is interesting. That's so interesting to talk to somebody that you didn't really even realize what you were what you had at the time as a young boy when you're using this stone, probably just whatever your dad told you. I mean, I imagine you would love to get your hand on that again.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, it got to where I didn't really need a stone.
Okay.
Um, One time I lost a really expensive knife, and I was out in the desert running around at Dugway, and I looked down. I was a Boy Scout, and I had lost this knife that I paid $100 for, and then that day that was a lot of money. And so I knelt down and prayed, and I said, "Just show me where it is." And that's where I saw it next to a tree, where I had leaned up against to take a break, and so it had fallen out of the sheath, just come out. And so I ran back, and it was right there, right where I saw it.
Fascinating. So do you feel like in many ways, I've heard similar stories with Joseph that early on he needed the stone, but then after a while he no longer required the stone. So do you think it was kind of a similar development for you?
I think it was exactly the same. Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating. Well, I'm very, very interesting. And also, real quick, you had mentioned Hugh Nibley, and I just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about your story when you went to see Hugh Nibley and what he had to say about your dad and his work. I find that to be a fascinating story. I'll just tell that real quick.
Yeah, well, Dad had a couple of these questions and stuff that I he couldn't answer, and he says you need to go see Hugh. And so he called up Hugh and said, "Hey, my son's coming over, and do you have any time?" He says, "Oh, send him right up." And so I went up to his office, and he was there. He'd come out, little cheerful, happy little guy, and we were chatting about all these things, and he says, "Well, let's walk home to my house, and then I got to eat, and then I'll walk back. And during those walking times, we have some time, so let's do that." And I said, "Okay." And I waited for him to finish his dinner, and then on the way back, I started asking him all these deep doctrinal questions, and he kind of turned to me, and he was like, "Wow, where do you get these questions from?" you know. And he answered pretty much all of them, in very good detail. And so as time went by, we went up and sat down, and I was talking to him. I said, "Here's my dad. He's excommunicated, and I don't know, I don't know, but I've been reading his books, and all of them, almost everything that I've read, it just brings the spirit of God. I feel the old religion, the old things." And Hugh said, "Oh, your father can still be saved." And then we chat a little bit about that and the excommunication and that kind of thing. And he says, "Just never mind. It's not, God's the judge of this, and your father's done a great work." And he said, "Out of all the people that I know, your father has saved more people from the anti-Mormons than anybody I know." And he said, "And I haven't read any of your father's works at that time up to that point." He said, I haven't read anything that isn't the pure gospel of Jesus Christ."
Yes.
And so he was pretty adamant about that. He told a story where a lot of people would come into his office asking about Adam God, and they would, there'd be kind of tipping on anti-Mormonism and whether they wanted to leave the church. And he would say, "Well, go down and read that book by Ogden Kraut, Michael Adam. And then once you read it, study it through, and then come back, and then we have a basis to talk about, and we'll talk about that." And he says, "Man, everybody come back, and they go, 'Okay, Hugh, I got it. I got it figured out. I understand,' because Dad just answered the questions." And then they'd go back to doing their calling and doing things in the church, and so he said, "Yeah, so it saved a lot of people from a lot of problems that were going."
And just real quick, since we're on the subject, of course, your father was good friends with the Tanners as well. Did you ever interact much with them?
Yes, I did. Yeah, yeah, and Dad knew Gerald Tanner before he became anti-Mormon.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah, so they were good friends and talked doctrine and all kinds of stuff. And then Gerald kind of went off, and there were some reasons why I think he went. I think things were kind of rough on his part, and then he kind of went a little bit dark and distant on that. His wife was always willing to share knowledge and information, and that was the greatest thing we got. Even Hugh Nibley said, "Well, they're our greatest. Uh, they find more goodies than anybody, you know, in the
That's right.
archives and other things. They're good researchers, or something." So
Certainly. Yeah, Gerald and Sandra Tanner really were important contributors to the whole Mormon studies community. A lot of BYU professors would go there to get materials because they couldn't get them from the church as well.
sure,
So
yeah,
I think they
hey,
did play a major role in disseminating very important information. And of course, Sandra's been on the program here, and she's a good friend. And I'm one of my biggest regrets in my life is I never had the opportunity to meet Gerald because I've heard a lot of good about him as well. And I've always been fascinated by the relationship that Tanner's had with your family, and I think that's just an interesting story that I know is covered a little bit in the book recently that came out about the Tanners as well. So yeah, well, okay. Well, I love talking about the Hugh Nibleys and the Gerald and Sandra Tanners and Sear Stones. That's just absolutely fascinating stuff to me. But I wanted you to relate to everybody and kind of give the background here about your experience with Ezra Taft Benson that you had in the Boy Scouts. Maybe set that story, and then a later experience you would have. Just tell the story. I'd love to hear it.
okay. Well, when I was a young boy, I always wanted to be an Eagle Scout. I wanted to really do a lot in scouting, and I put forth a great deal of effort. I was an Eagle Scout. I had four palms. I went when I was 16. I had the opportunity to go to a it was a National Scout Jamboree in Virginia, and so I was pretty excited about it. I raised up the funds. My dad had a kind of a thing where if you raise half, I'll raise half. If it's a big project or a big thing or whatever, you show me that you really want to go, and I'll make the other half. So he did, and on the way out, um, I was quite the over extreme LDS boy. I mean, everything was church to me. Everything was the gospel, and I took like maybe 10 to 15 Book of Mormons with me. They were the hardback kind of version, nicer looking ones. And before I left, I told my mom, I says, I'm going to convert 15 people. Every Book of Mormon I'm going to give to somebody, and it's gonna make it happen. So we got on an airplane and to fly from Arizona up to Salt Lake City, and then from Salt Lake City we took an airplane out to Virginia. And so this whole group, this whole scout troop from Arizona, um, there was a man in Mason. He was a kind of our scout leader there and scoutmaster, and he was a very successful businessman selling mobile homes and that kind of thing. And he was a bishop, and so he was very LDS type oriented. And anyway, on the plane, I met this boy. He sat next to me, and I gave him a Book of Mormon and started teaching him all about the Book of Mormon and all about Mormonism and everything. And he literally read that entire Book of Mormon while we were out there. And this bishop came, the state, well, actually, he was our scoutmaster, came and said, all he's doing is reading. He needs to come and be active and do parts and do things. And so I came and took the Book of Mormon away and said, you can't read this until you go and participate in what you came here for, And then I told him stories, and I said I'll help him with more things and whatnot. So he was pretty excited, and he went back and converted his whole family, and it was a big family, cousins, uncles, aunts. I mean, that was a huge amount of people just from that one plane trip. And so I was constantly doing this all through everywhere I went. I was doing missionary work, talking, 16-year-old kid just going at it. And so when we got to uh, Virginia, one of the interesting things was that you know there were all the LDS kids congregated and came to this. It's kind of an open amphitheater type thing, And then we got to meet the president of the church, and that was Ezra Taft Benson at the time. And so he rolled up in a limo, and he came up and he gave this beautiful speech, all about the Constitution and all these things, and the whole scout troop knew kind of that I was this, crazy, outlandish missionary type kid. So they all were excited when I got to go see Ezra Taft Benson, because all of us got to go up and shake his hand and ask him questions or different things. So I was pretty excited. I wanted to get up there and see him. And so I got up and walked up, and he looked at me and he smiled, and he said, "What is your name?" And I said, "My name is Kevin." He goes, "Well, what's your last name?" And I said, "Kraut." And right then, everything shut down. He just looked down at the ground and didn't talk to me. And I was kind of like, wow, what was that about? And I went, and everybody was disappointed. They were like, what was that about? It was just strange. We're so excited for you they were even kind of clapping and stuff when I got to meet him. And it was a really kind of a disappointing thing. And I came back and I was kind of praying in my mind, what about this? And well, I knew Dad and him had written back and forth, and Dad had kind of there was a writing that Ezra Taft Benson said, "Follow the Prophet" by Ezra Taft Benson. He gave a speech at BYU, and in fact, I've met people that were there at that speech, and one guy came in and he said that was the worst speech I've ever heard Ezra Taft Benson give, and it didn't go along with scripture. There was some real things. And so Dad had a response back, and it was "Follow the Lord" by Ogden Kraut. That we're not supposed to follow the arm of flesh, we're supposed to. And so it was really kind of a profound thing. And I think maybe that kind of distanced Ezra Taft Benson from my father because Dad was right, And this one guy that was telling me the story, he said, I watched people literally get up and walk out of that. It was at a BYU symposium or a devotional or something. Anyway, he said, I saw people literally get up and walk out because they were disappointed. And so I just figured that was what it was, which it was probably that. And I came back and everybody, what was that all about? And I said, oh, I think I think my dad and him kind of had a little rift or something, and okay, that's fine. But, it didn't really sit well with me. It kind of really hurt my feelings. And for the longest time of my life, I just, that's where I kind of learned people are people, whether they're in high positions or not. I met a lot of general authorities and a lot of people, and I saw sides of them that was, human nature rather than, the great president of the church, type thing. And so that helped me actually in some ways, because then I wasn't so connected to that. I was more connected with the gospel, the principles of the gospel, not just the personalities. And so many years later, it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago. It was really interesting because in the middle of the night, I was kind of woke up, but still kind of asleep. It was a weird experience. And they say in the body or out, I know not, that kind of thing. But Ezra Taft Benson came to my side of the bed and said, come with me. And he took me up to, I believe, his house in Idaho.
And just to be clear to everybody, Ezra, for those of you who don't know, Ezra Taft Benson by this time has passed away. So this is a
Right.
vision or some kind of dream that you're experiencing with him. Okay.
Right. Yes. Yes. Good clarification. Yeah. So he takes me by spirit, or however we went, to his house. Now, recently, I can't remember if it was son or nephew, but it was one of the Benson boys. He may have been the one in Arizona that wrote all this stuff, did the artwork or whatever. I can't remember. One of those passed away. And so we ended up in his house, And he had his kitchen table there, and he put me where he would sit at the front of the table. And so he sat me down, and he's telling his family, and of course, this Benson boy was there. And you have to kind of understand the very first YouTube that I ever did was the story of Ezra Taft Benson. And it was told to me, and you can look this up, but it was a story where um, his massage therapist was working with him, and and then he says, "We're really worried about you, President Benson.
Yeah.
You kind of tell a lot about the bad guys over in Washington D.C. and we're afraid they might kill you or do something crazy. You know, you need to be careful." And President Benson walked over and pulled the curtain back and pointed out to the church headquarters and said, "There are more people in that building that I am more afraid of than anybody in Washington, D.C." And so when I first did that, there's some people out there that wouldn't appreciate that video. And I was pretty scared to do it, but I did it anyway. And then that son or nephew or whoever it was called me, and he was pretty much blasting me that, no, you know, out of his office you wouldn't. I said, well, I never said that it was his office. It could have been anywhere. I mean, why would he be doing a massage in his office? You know, probably a private room or something where he's getting this. He had a lot of back problems and things, and so he was getting this done. and and so he got, oh, I see. Oh, well, what about this and what about that? And so I answered a lot of questions for this individual, so I may have helped him. And so anyway, I was sitting there at the front of the table, and like a father, he got behind me and put his hands on my shoulders,
Okay.
and he started telling things that I'd done to help their family. You know, the video had helped a lot of people understand things. He'd answered questions to his son. I somehow had taken a risk for my own family to put that out to help people. And then I felt this overwhelming sorrow in his heart for how he had treated me as a young 16-year-old Boy Scout on that day. And it was made known to me that President Benson couldn't progress further because he needed to make that apology. And it was a very, very heartfelt apology. One thing about Ezra Taft Benson was within him, he was a very strong individual, but he had a very deep love and a very deep calming effect on people. And this is what happened during that time. Very very beautiful, honorable man.
So everything came full circle. You had this was kind of a negative experience with him in your youth, but then he appears to you after he's passed away, and he is able basically to reconcile with you, and it really is a beautiful story about reconciliation and redemption, and you're being able to help him and his family. And I did want to say something too, Kevin. And I may have mentioned this to you when I first met you, but I sent that video that you did about Ezra Taft Benson. And it was, and you're relaying a story from, it was a pretty prominent chiropractor that told you the story, is if I'm not mistaken. And so I sent this to one of the leading scholars who's written extensively on Ezra Taft Benson. And I sent this, and he's got a PhD and everything, real smart guy. I won't say his name over the air just because I didn't get clear the okay to tell this story publicly with his name attached to it. Although I don't think he'd mind. I sent him the video, and he emailed me back, and he says that's absolutely sounds just like Ezra. That is like he has no doubts that that is a true story, and he's one of the leading scholars on Ezra Taft Benson. So I think there's definitely a lot. Once I heard it from him, like okay, as far as I'm concerned, that's a true story of one of the leading scholars. Also admits it as well. So now I'll share with you off camera who that was, but. I just want to say I felt like your story has been, in one sense, um, been acknowledged as probably being a very true account.
Yes. Yeah, very, very impressive story.
So I guess, and just for my understanding, and again, I don't want to get too many details because this is a sacred experience that you had, but just for people to understand, like when you're in your room, how did you know? Like, did he just suddenly appear to you, and you knew it was him right away? What did he look like? Did he look like middle aged, his older self? Did he look like the person that you encountered when you were a kid? I mean, what? Just maybe talk a little bit about whatever you're comfortable talking about.
Probably the same way that I remember. He was an older man, not as old, but he was about like when I was 16.
Okay.
Is how he appeared to me.
And that would make sense that he would appear in that way, in that form to you, because that would be the best, most probably the most recognizable. You would see him in that sense too, you know.
Right, right.
Okay. And you say you like, I guess the question I would have is because I've had other people on who've had visionary experiences, some who have seen Jesus or have been taken, up into the heavens and stuff like that. And I'm just curious, like, if somebody else were in that room, would they have seen this as well? Like, how would you, or would it have been something like with the Apostle Paul, where he's having a vision but the other people aren't seeing it? How would you describe the setting that it was in?
Um, in the bedroom, it was just me and him, and
Uh-huh.
he got me. The experience where I'm at the front of the table, everybody in the room saw me, and I
Okay.
saw them. I and I would believe in my heart that everybody in that room had already passed on.
Right.
So this
Okay.
would be like in a spiritual world or another realm or
Yeah.
another. And so, and I can still kind of recognize some of the people. Seemed like Ezra Taft Benson's wife was there,
Okay.
but Sue at the very far end. Um, and it was a very emotional thing, and it was his spirit being very grateful for me and what I had done, but also uh, the love that he portrayed was phenomenal. I never saw Ezra Taft Benson as such a deep, loving man. We knew Spencer Kimball was always loving and all that, but when he got deeply emotional, he got deeply emotional, and it was like a love for your own son, your own, and that lasted for about 3 days. I could feel that
Huh.
feeling, you know, and sometimes when I told the story before, when after it just happened, I could feel President Benson around me, and I would
Okay.
say, in my head, I would say, "Do you want me to tell this?" And one time I felt this, him kind of saying, "Well, you don't have to make me look that bad," you know, because he was kind of mean to me at that time. Yeah.
Yeah. So you said you felt like his presence for days afterwards, and it must have had a pretty profound spiritual experience. Did it have did it change the trajectory of your life or anything like that, or what kind of long-term effects did it have on you?
The long term effect was just the shock of such a powerful man having such a loving side. Um, I guess that was kind of a new thing to me, or made me realize that as a father or whatever, you've got to have that deep love for your children. You've got to have that. I didn't see that coming. That was kind of a hit.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So, one thing too is if you could do me a favor and send me the links to those videos. I know that originally you were on the Don Quixote channel, but now you have your own YouTube channel, right? That has all these same videos on there.
Yeah.
So make sure you send me a link, and I'll make sure I have that in the description for people to check out that video
Okay.
where you talk about Ezra Taft Benson and everything like that, and also Hugh Nibley and all that. I mean, just great stuff. I mean, I just love your video series, and the stories that you've told are really important. And really, I one of the most fascinating things is, of course, I have friends who are Christopher and Christine Blythe of BYU, who do a podcast on Mormon folklore and stories and stuff like that. And I told him that I was going to be interviewing you, a while back, and he was like, "Wow, this sounds really interesting. I'd love to have him maybe talk with him sometime too." And one of the things that's so fascinating within, okay, so in the evangelical world, in the charismatic world that I grew up in, we would have people who we would call them angel stories, where people would have experiences with angels. And I even had a school teacher, a fourth grade teacher, who had encounters with angels. I went to a Christian school. And so I grew up with this idea. This was not a foreign concept that angelic visitations are something that could happen today, much in the same way that Joseph Smith would had angelic visitations. You yourself have had visitations, and maybe just relay a story or two of some relay, a story or two of some of your experiences with the three Nephites.
Yeah, okay. So I remember when the book was being created, my father wrote the book to the Three Nephites. And my dad was a storyteller. So as we were driving down the road, he'd be telling stories about people's encounters with the Three Nephites and other things, you know, and I guess part of the miracle of being a child of Ogden Kraut was he would tell these miraculous stories. And so I just figured everybody had these stories, or everybody encountered angels, or everybody had dreams. You know, I have a whole storybook of dreams with that KGB guy and all the stories that happened. And and the and the and the thing was is I would have dreams, and then the very next day they would happen. And I've had that up to as close as 5 minutes. And so we'll tell that story later. But so with all the stories of the three Nephites and the encounters with them and things, and my dad even told a few stories of things that he felt were three Nephites. And he said, I said, well, why doesn't finally when I got a little older, I said, how come everybody doesn't have stories of the three Nephites? And he said, because of wickedness, because once there's the people are starting to kind of go astray from the gospel, it seems like those stories of three Nephites just don't happen as much. And I'll quickly relay one of the stories was that I told was that it happened up here in Alpine, and I was studying kind of a lot about it wasn't just the Adam God doctrine, but it had to do with the beginnings of our world and some of those questions I asked Hugh Nibley, and he kind of smiled, but he didn't answer them. So he knew what the answers were, but he just kind of thought, well, I'll let him find out on his own type thing. So I was really questioning and asking, and we were working, doing tile work up in that area in Alpine, and when I came around the corner, and we went to a gas station for lunch, and we got there, and there was a little place over here next to it that it had a little restaurant and that kind of thing, and so I walked in, and there was kind of this old Indian looking guy, kind of grayish hair, long hair, kind of sitting over on the other end. And so I walked up and kind of talked to him. I grew up with Indians, and he looks up at me, and he's kind of got this bluish eye, In other words, it wasn't brown. It had kind of bluish about it. And some of the Maoris, when they get old, they kind of had that same type of eye. So anyway, I was kind of talking to him, and he was kind of had all these notes and different things, and he was kind of chatting. He looks up at me, and he started kind of blasting Joseph Smith, like Joseph Smith wasn't this and he wasn't that, and da, 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 and I could tell he was testing me. And he was just kind of doing this falsetto thing, just to kind of see what my reactions were. and uh, and then we kind of got done, and I turned around, and they called my name or something, or somebody said something, and I turned around, and then I turned back to look at him, and he was gone. And it was this fast from here to there, gone. And I'm looking around, and I'm in between him and the doorway, so I'm like, okay. that was a Three Nephites. So I went home and I prayed and I said, I didn't really get my answer and I really want to know. And I want you to bring him back. I want to go back. We never go to the same place for lunch. And we went back to the same place for lunch. And sure enough, there he was.
Okay.
And so I walk up to him and he looks up at me. And this time he's not playing games.
Okay.
This time he just looks right at me, square in the eye, and he says, Kevin, he says, the answer to your questions is in the first three verses of the Bible, but not the King James. You have to go to these other older style Bibles to find the answer. And then once again, after he told me that, I turned, somebody called or did something. I turned and looked that way and looked back, and he was gone.
Okay, so what was the answers to your question, and what version of the Bible did you find that
Well, I
gave you
went
those
back to some of
answers?
the old standard Bibles. And now there was three or four questions that I had, and I can't remember all of them, but it had to do with that Adam, was a god.
Uh-huh.
As Hugh Nibley says, in some of the folklore of the culture and the Egyptian was that there were 22 gods, which is the 22 letters of the Hebrew, and they were the ones that were the council. And one of those gods wasn't paying attention, and when they were just trying to decide who was going to go down and start creation on an earth, and so they says, "Well, you're the one that needs to go down." And no, I don't want to go down to mortality. I don't want to go through that again. And oh no, you're the one. And so they took him and threw him down to earth. And as he's running, he stumbles and falls and hits his nose. And he looks at it and he goes, "Oh man," his bloody nose. And he goes, "I'm immortal." So that was a story he never told me about, the out of God basically. So,
Hmm.
so the questions were, kind of I can't remember all, but there were deeper questions of how and who was determined and what was there. I was walking with you one day and I said, it's kind of a beautiful concept because my great 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 physical grandfather was God. So I'm literally of his flesh and bone and spirit. And I said, it's a beautiful concept when you think about it. We're just great, 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 great grandchildren of a man who was once in heaven. And he turned to me and he got this fun look and he goes, wow, yeah, you're getting it. And so it can be a beautiful thing when you think about we really are children of God. We've really come through in his bloodline.
And so you were able to. Now, what made you certain that that individual spoken with was one of the three Nephites?
It just you just have that feeling like this guy's just not normal. He's
Uh-huh.
just you're around people sometimes and they're mentally disturbed or something, and you go, that guy's just off. That's just different. And that's kind of how this guy was. He was kind of the same. And and the one thing that I share with most people is that during the time that you're talking to the individual, you're not realizing that he's one of the three Nephites. You're just kind of, and that's the trick. You kind of trick you into thinking I'm just normal. And then they always like to disappear right when you're not looking, or shut the door and you come back and look out the door and there's steps. I had that happen once with a truck. I don't think I've ever told this story. I was truck driving and I picked up a hitchhiker. And back in those days, you picked up hitchhikers. And I picked up this guy, and he was telling me a lot of stuff, spiritual stuff too. Kind of prompting me on different things about what I should do in life. And you just think, oh, that's just a guy that knows a lot of stuff. So I'm learning from him type attitude. That's how you felt. And then before we got to the city, he said, "Wait, I need to get out here." And I go, "Here? I mean, this is Wyoming. This is cold. This is no, no, no. It's right here. This is where my friend's house is, or something." Oh, okay, And so I let him out the door, and he got out, and I waved, and he waved, and then I had to look at some stuff um, on my logbook or something, and then I had that feeling like guy just wasn't normal. Something was different about him. So I got out of the truck and walked around, just like everybody says. They see 3 or 4 footsteps, and then there's no more. And that's what happened to me on that one. So,
So my question for you is, do the Nephites, are they able to change their appearance, or are like have you seen all three Nephites at once? Do
well,
they? Okay,
I I think they can change the way they look. I
okay,
think it's possible. Um, I couldn't say that I've met all three, but there's one in particular that seems to stick around our family, and that was the story. When I relayed this story to my brother about this guy up in Alpine. He had kind of a certain freckle right here, and he had those eyes, and he had a certain demeanor about him. And so I'm describing this, and my brother's wife kind of laughs, and she looks over at my brother and goes, "Well, that sounds just about like the one you encountered, huh?" And my brother goes, "Yeah, that sounds just like him." And his personality and the way he carried himself and all of this. And I said, "Well, let's hear your story." And so my brother tells the story. And my brother he was a wild kid. I mean, he was on drugs. He had long hair when he was in 12th grade. He drove a biker's bike, and had all this stuff. He just rebelled. And then out of the blue, he decided he'd better go on a mission. So he cut his hair, straightened himself up, went to the bishop. Bishop said, "Well, we're going to have to kind of wait a little while, but let's get you on your mission." And then my brother started having doubts. Maybe I wouldn't make a good missionary. I'm too far gone. And so he went up in Skull Valley, um, near Dugway, and there's this big, big valley. There's nothing there, and so it was kind of up against the mountain. And he went up the mountain. He hiked up the mountain up to the kind of the top peak there, and prayed really fervently to know whether he'd be a good missionary or a bad missionary, or whether he should go on a mission or whatever. And he felt like God didn't really answer his his call, which happens a lot. And so he's walking down, and as he's walking down, there's this Indian. He's trying to load up this big bale of hay. It wasn't like big ton one, and it wasn't like a little small one. It's kind of in between. And he's trying to pick it up, put it in his truck, and he said, "Man, he's never going to get that in there." And my brothers were always really big and hefty and pretty strong. They had white muscle. My one brother, guy says, "Well, unload all this freezer, all the stuff out of the freezer, and then move the freezer over here, and I'll pay you this much money." And my brother goes, "You want this freezer right there?" And he goes, "Yeah." And he reached around the freezer with all the food in it, picks it up, lifts it over, puts it down over here. It's a pretty strong group. And so my brother goes over and he picks that bale up and just throws it in for this Indian. The Indian goes, "Man, I'd never got that in there without your help." And he looks at my brother and really intently looks in the eyes, and he says, "And by the way, I think you would make a great missionary." My brother kind of took my brother back, and then this Indian got in the truck and was driving away. Like in the movies, the truck's going, and then all of a sudden, you're seeing dust. Then all of a sudden, the pickup disappears, and then the dust quits going away, and he's looking, and he's just like, "Oh, that was really interesting."
Oh, so he had one of the Nephites basically say he's going to be a good missionary, and he went on his
And
mission, I assume.
and apparently, it was the same one that came to me
Okay.
in that, because the way I described him was exactly. He said, "He's
Wow.
exactly the way."
Wow.
That,
Interesting. So let me ask you, if if nowadays people have their cameras on them and everything, with their phones, if you could, would you be able in the experiences that you've had, if you had a camera on you, would you have been able to take a picture of them, and would they show up on the photo, do you think?
I think so, but I think they're so tricky
Uh-huh.
that they kind of play with your mind and make you forget
Okay.
have a phone, or your phone wouldn't work, or you know
Okay.
what I'm saying. They have that power, so they would just,
Kind of like a Jedi a little bit.
yeah, you forgot your phone, or
Yeah.
I heard another story. My friend Doc Hansen, he was telling me a story about a guy that had an encounter with one of the three Nephites, and it was very same close to mine, and he actually had a list of questions he was going to ask this three Nephite when he finally showed up. And then the three Nephites showed up, and he kind of let him know that he was one of the three Nephites, and then he disappeared, and then he remembered his list. He goes, "Oh, I forgot my list." And so they can do that. They can forget. Or
Interesting. So okay, that's great perspective, great insight that you can give on your experience and your friends' experiences with encountering the three Nephites. It's for a lot of people, haven't had a lot of people listening may have never had a single spiritual experience in their life. And here you've had multiple spiritual experiences. It seems like you operate on some kind of plane that I imagine a lot of people would be very fascinated. Like how do you suppose you're able to tap into this in a way that a lot of people are not able to?
well, the first thing is I didn't doubt. As a child, I just always believed that it was possible. That these things. But I also came out kind of weird. I was just a strange kid. I went to a high school reunion 20 years afterwards or something, and before I went, I was prompted to get a Book of Mormon, a certain old style Book of Mormon, and take it with me. And I knew that I was supposed to give it to this girl. Her name was Mickey Fallis, and Mickey, she was Japanese, and all this, and there's quite a history behind her. I won't tell all that I know, but so I get there to this reunion, and she goes, you were always kind of the quiet kid, Kevin. You were just kind of different, you know, and you had all these dreams, and you did strange stuff, and I'm sitting there kind of looking at her, and I'm kind of cross-eyed, and I go, oh, you mean like how I see these two people next to you? And she goes, you can see spiritual beings next to me? And I said, yeah. And one has a kimono, and it's this, and it has this gold. And then I described another one, and she goes, oh my gosh, that's my mother and my grandmother. And she came through royal lines in Japan. So these were empress type clothing. And she just kind of dropped a tear. She was kind of getting emotional. And she goes, and I go, well, I guess that's why I was just weird, Mickey. I just was weird, you know. And then I gave her the Book of Mormon, and she goes, "Oh, I always wanted this. I always heard about Mormons. I never know anything about it." And then I got to thinking about it later that afternoon after I was driving home, and I was going, I had that deja vu feeling, like I'd been here experiencing that, handing her that Book of Mormon, and I thought, I wonder if that was a dream that I had before, and now I lived it. And so I went back and looked through my missionary journal, and I'm going through my missionary journal, and I have a bunch of dreams there. And one of the dreams was gave a Book of Mormon to Mickey Falls.
Huh.
And so there, I lived it.
Huh. Interesting,
So I was
interesting.
weird. I know I do weird stuff. It was even harder after my near death. And my wife says, he's just nuts because I'll say something to somebody, but but it's not really clear because I'm expecting them to already know what I'm thinking because I know what they're thinking. And so there's that telepathy going on. And she says, well, he thinks that you know already. Kind of messed up.
Wow, and so fascinating. And your father was a very important person in this world, and it's a real privilege. I'm glad that we were able to have you on last time to talk about your father's experiences with the Dream Mine. You yourself have some fascinating stories to tell as well. Again, I'll send me a link to your YouTube channel, Kevin, and I'll make sure that I post that in the show notes so people can check out some more of your stories. And I'd like to have you come back on and tell some more stories. I think you're an important voice in the restoration. I think you do a really important work. You're somebody that's publishes books and are a very important voice in this whole space. And Kevin Kraut, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the program today. As always, it's a real pleasure to have these great conversations with you.
Well, it's really been good, and I'll just tell our audience, you'll encounter people, and a lot of people don't realize. I was talking to a guy, and I said, "That was a three Nephite, don't you?" And he goes, "Oh, so you're not thinking at the time." So I just tell them, just watch. You may encounter and not know it. So there we go.
There you go. There you go, folks. For all you know, you may be entertaining angels unaware, and be maybe try to get tapped into it a little better because maybe you're missing out on these interesting experiences. Kevin, as always, this is great. I really enjoyed the conversation. We're going to have links in the description to everything we talked about. Also, for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel, we do have links in the description there as well. And want to thank all those who are supporting the channel. Couldn't do it without you. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.